Hey everybody, welcome to the Ethicsverse, the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you think that changing our workplaces is going to change the world, got a real treat for you today. We're talking about modern whistleblowing, a new era of accountability. We have some great guests. The coolest guy in compliance, Matt Kelly. We have Jonathan Turner and Mary Inman. So let's give them a warm Ethicsverse welcome. I'd love to see a wave of emojis. None of us have had lunch yet. A couple of quick announcements. We love pushing all the thought leadership that is going on in our space. If you're not sharpening your sword, you're not sharpening your saw, you're staying stagnant. So check some of these things out. The Two Gurus Talk Compliance is my new favorite podcast that comes out every 2 weeks. If you want to hit this QR code, you can see all the books. We just updated the Ethico library of all the books that we love to give away. So check that out. Coming up next. Oh, no, here's the QR code. How you doing? Okay, coming up next on the ethics experts, we have Olaf Kasperson. This is a great episode. My mom couldn't stop sharing this on Facebook, okay? So if you follow my mom on Facebook, I'm sure you've seen this a bunch. Olaf Kasperson has done some really cool innovations in his program. He outlines those in the ethics experts, and I encourage you to check that out. The FCPA survival guide is blowing the doors off of all those Amazon drivers, all those warehouses. So check that out. You can scan this QR code and grab the book, or you can scan the QR code and the other one, and you can see all the episodes on YouTube. It's 10 quick episodes, little bite-sized pieces, where we walk through the FCPA survival guide, me and the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. If you're coming to CEI in Texas in a couple of weeks, come and join us at our booth, our world famous No Pitch Zone Ethico booth. We're also going to be having a killer cocktail party on Monday night, so hope you guys can swing by. Speaking of, listen to all these books we got. This is going to be, we're giving away more books than ever at this conference. Listen to some of these titles. We're giving away the Compliance Kids series, the Tom Fox series, which is really fun. The Champions Network, Raise Your Game, Not Your Voice, How to Be a Wildly Effective Compliance Officer, Your Year as a Wildly Effective Compliance Officer, Living Your Best Compliance Life, Ethics and Compliance for Humans, To Be Honest, love that book, Establishing Workplace Integrity, Higher Ground, Humanizing Rules, Bootstrapping Ethics, The Right Way to Win, Help Them Grow or Watch Them Go, Unlearning Silence, Business Ethics Learned from a Citigroup Whistleblower. That'll be a good one for today. Influence is Your Superpower, and The Fearless Organization by the one and only Amy Edmondson. So swing on by the booth. We're going to be doing another mini documentary with, of course, the tiny hands that everybody loves. Also, for all of our healthcare folks, we love you so much. We're going to start doing an Ethicsverse specifically for healthcare. The first episode is on 9/17, so spread the word. We're going to be talking to the one and only Ross Ronan of Ronan Consulting. And he's phenomenal. So if you guys don't follow him on LinkedIn, I'd encourage you to do so. His podcast is great, as well as the Compliance Leadership Lounge. I keep wanting to push this middle manager toolkit because it's so freaking good. So there's a ton of risk intelligence in your organization. Your job is to crowdsource that risk intelligence and push those insights back to those points of risk so that you can de-risk the organization. Your organization can run more smoothly. The point is, people are 6 to 8 times more likely to go to a middle manager versus engaging in this anonymous hotline that you have in place. So how do we activate these folks? Well, we got you taken care of here. So check this QR code out. There should be a link in the chat, wink, wink. And there's a ton of resources in there. So you can train your middle managers. You can engage them. You can give them some things to say. We even have a bunch of graphics that you can customize and put on your email signature. And we even have a marketing calendar. So you can really plan out some themes quarter to quarter to make sure that ethics is part of the conversation. Quick little plug for Ethico. I wanted to share this. This came across my desk yesterday, and I just love this. It's so beautiful. This was me here crying. Continue to invest in your people. It really shows that they enjoy working at Ethico. The amount of people I've spoken to who have worked in multiple roles and or departments that can provide insight into the areas other than their current job is very valuable for a customer like me. So our company is really built on quality first. We think that there's so much potential in the ethics, compliance, the human resource departments, many of which are viewed as cost centers, many of which are viewed as apart from the business instead of a part of the business. And the more we can do to unlock that potential, the more impact we can have in our organization. So our software helps you close your cases a lot faster. We have no abandonment rate, essentially under 1% abandonment rate, and our substantiation rate and our our anonymous rate are significantly better than what you would expect. And again, here's a little glimpse of our commitment to quality. All of the people that run our intake center, this is just a little example, they're all CCEP certified. So if you sat for that test, you know that's a very difficult test to get through. And again, if we can be an extension of our client's team, then there's a lot of magic that can come from these operations. So if you haven't checked out the ecosystem, hit this, go to ethico.com and you can book a demo, no pitch zone demo, and just see what's out there. It's incumbent on you. It's your job to know what options are out there because so many things are changing. All right. Today, we are going to be giving away one of my favorite all-time books, The Fearless Organization by the one and only Amy Edmondson. So please drop your comments in the chat, drop your questions, share with us the insights that correspond to this topic of the new era of whistleblowing to be entered to win. Finally, if you are not like me, then you are not waking up and going to sleep reading at Radical Compliance. So if you're not following that on LinkedIn, if you don't check out his website, time to, step your game up here. So Matt Kelly puts out phenomenal content constantly. If you hear me say something smart, there's a pretty good chance I stole that or creatively borrowed it. I'll say creatively borrowed that from one of Matt's articles. So with that, I will pass it to the one and only coolest guy in compliance, Matt Kelly.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, and very much appreciate the kind words there for the newsletter. So we here are today going to talk about whistleblowing issues at a company. And I got the idea for this basically because the Justice Department recently launched its new Whistleblower Reward Program, modeled after the SEC award program and multiple other regulators who have awards programs out there. I really wanted to talk about how does the existence of those programs change a company's thinking about what do we do with internal whistleblowers? What do we do about disclosing an issue we know to regulators? Does that change your calculus? Should it change your calculus? And also a little bit about, what a whistleblower's journey is, because honestly, it is not easy. And these reward programs make it look like there's a nice pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Truth is, it's a very long and arduous path. And at the end, you might find there is nothing and no rainbow either. That is also very possible for a lot of whistleblowers. So we have great speakers with us to cover all of that. Nick, as always, also Jonathan Turner, who is Global Chief Ethics and Compliance Leader at Zoll Medical from Pittsburgh, I think. Jonathan, welcome. Thank you for being there.
Thanks, Matt. Looking forward to this conversation.
And also with us is Mary Inman, who is a whistleblower representative, an attorney, and she is these days just started her own firm with a few other whistleblower lawyers called, I think it's just Whistleblower Partners. Am I correct, Mary?
You got it.
Well, thank you very much for both of you and for everybody else joining us. And as always, if you have a question or comment that you want to make about things as we are discussing them, listeners, by all means, put in your comments and your questions in the chat, and we will weave those in as soon as we can. I just wanted to kick off with a question about these whistleblower reward programs. Most notably is the one at the Justice Department because it's the newest. But with all of these things out there, these award programs, what are compliance officers supposed to make of them? Should you be thinking about them in as how you build your internal program and what you do with a whistleblower complaint that comes to your internal hotline? Basically, I want to know, are these variables that should fit into the equations as you think about whistleblowing or not? Jonathan, I'll start with you, and then Mary, and then Nick. But what are we supposed to do with these things that are out there?
So I think it's really important as we think about sort of the impact, right? Because this allows the opportunity for the impact of one of these hits to be worse. But as a realistic measure, if you're doing the right thing, you have a speak up culture, you're responding to your employees' concerns, you're hoping to avoid these issues before they ever reach a whistleblower stage, because that's really the deep level of frustration. So I guess the short answer is we want to use this as a way of helping people understand the impact of not having a good speak up culture in your organization, rather than we want to be trying to stop people from calling a regulator. We're trying to fix those problems long before they're thinking about a regulator.
All right. And Mary, from your perspective dealing with whistleblowers, what do you think that the existence of these reward programs does? Like, I had gone into this thinking they add pressure to corporate compliance programs we don't want them to go to the regulators without informing us or working with us, and now maybe they will. I thought this turns up the pressure, but am I right? Am I wrong? What do you think?
I think it turns up the pressure. You ignore, as a company, you ignore these programs at your peril. But I also think it creates lots of opportunities. One of the biggest developments here, and I think the DOJ's corporate pilot program is notable, is that it's showing that these programs are expanding. They are not going away. It started in 1986 with the False Claims Act amendments, and then the success of that program with whistleblowers launching lawsuits in the name of the government and returning trillions of dollars to the U.S. Treasury. Then the IRS, the SEC, decided they didn't want to miss out, and they wanted to leverage the power of whistleblowers to basically supercharge their enforcement efforts. So we've continued to see an expansion. The Transportation Department adopted one. It's our first whistleblower program rewarding whistleblowers in the public safety space. And then on went the Treasury Department with money laundering and sanctions law violations. So it's not surprising the DOJ was having FOMO. DOJ obviously has had the False Claims Act for years, but this is the first time they've gotten in on a tip program. So I think the takeaway I have for your audience is that these programs are not going away. And in fact, I think we're going to continue to see them expand. And the DOJ program in particular is in its name. It's a pilot program. It's got a 3-year tenure, and it is notable to me that DOJ didn't wait for Congress to give them a program like we saw with Dodd-Frank and the SEC. Instead, they created it out of their authority, their existing authorities. And so I expect what they're signaling here is that they want Congress to give them more power. So these aren't going away, and I think companies are wise to find ways to channel whistleblowers to make sure they're reporting internally first. The last thing I'll say, because I hate to be on a fear-mongering I'd rather end on a positive note. The SEC has regularly tracked statistics. I think there's a fear that if you have reward programs, it'll encourage whistleblowers to bypass internal reporting channels. That has not been my anecdotal experience in 27 years, but it's also reflected in the number. The SEC, when it tracked these numbers for years, said around 85% of all whistleblowers receiving rewards reported internally first. So if you're listening as a company, you're still going to get that opportunity. That's the first port of call for whistleblowers. They don't want to burn their careers, and often they don't even know they're whistleblowers. If you're head of internal audit and you're reporting on an issue, often you don't even know you're a whistleblower. You're just doing your job, and you don't know you're a whistleblower until you're treated like one and you're retaliated against.
All right. Nick, I want to get your thoughts, and also for everybody listening, if you just want to pop in your thoughts in the attendee chat, what do you think of these programs? Are they something you keep an eye on and they weigh on your mind, or are they more like the weather? You're aware that it's happening, but it is what it is. You got life to lead. But Nick, what do you think about these reward programs, how they fit into the bigger picture?
So I agree both with Jonathan and Mary, everything that they said. The way I think about it is, these are going to continue. It's, these are going to continue to grow. So it's kind of a question of like what we can control. And Jonathan kind of touched on it a little bit. And so did Mary, that this is, we need to have a culture where people feel comfortable coming forward. But that's kind of a slow metric. There's this concept of slow metrics and fast metrics. So it may take some time, a couple of quarters, maybe a couple of years, to really get the level of speak up in your organization to the level you want, where you're really getting this sort of outpouring of risk intelligence, and you're engaging, all these middle managers to like sing that song and bring that risk intelligence into that central brain. So that's kind of a slow metric. The fast metric, something you can start affecting immediately, and I think that these whistleblower programs kind of underscore this, is the importance of like closing those investigations as fast as possible and communicating back to folks. Because I know many cases where, somebody just reported internally, like Mary said, and they didn't hear back, or they didn't think that there was any movement, and then they went sort of somewhere else to like raise their hand. So like, what can you control right now? Well, you can put processes in place, or you can leverage whatever technology you have to really try to close those investigations a lot faster. And then again, communicate back to the individual reporting or the broader organization to really, sell that story that you care about these things and that you take these reports very serious.
Actually, that's a really good point, that a lot of times I wonder whether whistleblowers report internally and then they figure, I guess nothing's going on. I might as well go to a regulator. Like, you're mishandling the complaint at the start.
Right.
And then it sends it all, everything goes off on the wrong orbit trajectory. And suddenly, things are crashing into each other.
Matt, can I interject just really quickly, because it's radical compliance? I did want to note that in terms of some of the ideas here, I spoke recently at the International Bar Association's Corporate Governance Conference, and our panel topic was, should internal reporting systems actually pay whistleblowers themselves? So there are some concepts that we take a page out of the book, we blunt the DOJ and SEC's efforts by giving rewards. I think it's a very controversial topic, but this is radical compliance, and I would be remiss if I didn't raise it.
Well, I appreciate that. So I wanted to ask then about, what are the fundamentals you should get in place at the start to make sure that wherever this issue goes, it at least kind of zigzags down a desirable path instead of wandering off into some unfortunate path. So let's say the internal report arrives via the hotline. What should the compliance officer do then in that, immediate first couple of days or first week or two as you're trying to figure out what end is up? Jonathan, I'll start with you, and then Mary and Nick again. But okay, you got the call, comes in, now what?
So there's a tendency in people's heads to sort of build hotline call systems like your check engine light on your dashboard, right? We don't know what it means and we don't know what to do. And realistically, you should handle this exactly like you would if somebody walked in your office and wanted to talk about an issue, right? The whistleblower report is not the flag of a disaster. It's the beginning of a conversation. So you always want to reach out and communicate with the person to the extent possible. Some people send a shot over the wall and never communicate. Some people provide lots of ways to communicate. But your goal is to communicate with the person and learn as much as you can about what they're concerned about. Sometimes what they say is not the actual issue, and sometimes it's much bigger than what they tell you in the quote unquote report. So that's the first step. It's a dialogue. The second step is, what can we validate? How do we need to do this? And to Nick's point earlier, make sure that people understand the timeline. If you need me to do a 6-month deep dive investigation, I need to let you know that, because you won't see a lot of activity for 6 months. On the other hand, if this is something that I can validate really quickly, I want to make sure you have an expectation of timeline. And then the third leg of this stool is, we always want to come back to our reporters and let them know the value of what they raised. So what did we do with it? How did that use for us? And sometimes it's letting them know that, hey, you saw this, but it really wasn't what you thought it was. And other times this is really, really important that you raise this, and this is what we're able to do with it. But again, I think this is, the mindset should be, if this person walked into your office and sat down across the desk, how would you handle that? And why would you handle this any differently?
So then, Mary, give me your response to that, because that all seems very sensible. And I sometimes wonder, well, how hard can it be to get that sort of engaged, respectful process rolling? I'm going to guess that you, over the course of your career, have seen all sorts of examples where companies have mishandled the whistleblower issue, and you're like, yeesh, this is going to be a mess. What goes wrong? Or how does this wind up going from what Jonathan described to something more tense?
Yeah, I think my gray-haired experience and perspective here is that you'd be astonished that it is across industry, and it's not surprising that companies, even including enlightened compliance officers, take a medieval approach to whistleblowing speak up, which is to shoot the messenger to divert attention from the message. It sounds extreme, but it's something that we're trained from very young age. So I think in terms of your question, what do you do when that first report comes across the bow? I think the first thing you think about is take yourself out of it. Get out of the defensive crouch that we've done something wrong and see it as a growth opportunity. Put yourself in the shoes of the whistleblower and recognize the temerity and the intestinal fortitude it takes to actually speak up. I think, unfortunately, we've seen with the death of the Boeing whistleblower, John Barnett, that we don't pay enough attention to the psychosocial impacts of whistleblowing. It's something we'll talk about, I know, Matt a little bit later. I think it really behooves us to be training our people on how to listen up. And to really put yourself in their shoes. So I also think there's a lot of alignment that compliance officers should have with whistleblowers. Whistleblowers and compliance officers are very similar, and I think the more you recognize your affinities, the better. That you're both trying to speak up to make the organization better. You're often, cost centers. You're maybe not the most popular voice in the room, but in a way you're the most important. And so I think some of the things we'll talk about later, I know, are some of the research that I think compliance officers should be armed with that actually shows that whistleblowers can be your best risk management tool. And the more we think about them that way and sort of suppress our childhood snitches get stitches mentality, the better it is for us. And don't be surprised. I mean, that tends to be human nature, that we get defensive when someone calls us out. And remember, whistleblowers don't always say it in the most diplomatic way. It doesn't mean what they're saying isn't valid.
It's an excellent point. Nick, what do you think about all of this here? And I see we got a flood of comments already from attendees, which is great too.
I was reading a study on parenting, and by reading a study, I of course mean watching a TikTok, and it said that you need like 8 to 10 times more positive reinforcement for every piece of negative reinforcement. And to Mary's point, I think we sometimes feel like when someone raises their hand and they're speaking up about something, we kind of fall back into that that sort of defensive posture, as she said. And I don't think that we should ever think of that as like an indication that our program is not doing what it's supposed to do. There's a ton more crap going on in the organization than is being reported. Like that chart I showed earlier said, 6 to 8 times more things are happening than what you're actually seeing. So I think going back to that study I was reading, we have to reinforce that positive behavior. We have to kind of positively reinforce that behavior. If we're trying to build a speak up culture, if it's nowhere near what that ideal or what that potential is, then the first thing we have to do is really acknowledge that. And as Mary said, join arms with that person. That person has probably already seen that for a while. They're probably already in a defensive posture. And if we can appreciate the courage that it took to raise their hand and be that culture guardian, then I think that can help to spread and lay like a stronger foundation for the inevitable, hopefully, speak up culture, high integrity culture that we're trying to build.
So here's a great point for the listener. Oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
Sorry, I just wanted to throw in one thing here. I really like Mary's point about psychosocial culture. And I'm going to pull a radical compliance piece for a second. As compliance officers, people approach us with questions all the time. And they might be mundane questions, and sometimes they're really significant ones. But if we distinguish our ordinary interactions with our colleagues from whistleblowers who we treat as some super special category, we actually create separation and distance that doesn't need to exist. To Nick's point here, we're trying to use these as a positive opportunity for leverage. So they aren't whistleblowers. They're the same kind of reporter that somebody walks in your office. And I'm not taking away whistleblower rights and protections when I say that. I'm saying we can create our own problems by categorizing them differently instead of recognizing that they're just another person asking a question or raising an issue, which is our day-to-day life. I completely agree with Mary that whistleblowers and compliance officers' interests should be very, very tightly aligned.
Yeah, we should be focusing on the human, not the implication of what this might mean from a, fine perspective or us getting in trouble. I think that's right. I mean, it's human to human. We need these humans to be part of this risk management apparatus if we're ever going to build this ideal that, we're kind of talking around.
Here's a question I wanted to weave in from one of the attendees, Kaveni Wong. She made a great comment. In my experience in ethics and compliance, whistleblowers are always welcome. I wonder if the defensiveness may come from the legal function. I was waiting for somebody to start asking about legal, where protecting the company is their job. And I had even made a note, Mary, when you talked about the defensive crouch, I thought, well, legal's job is to defend. What else would we expect from them? I don't know if there's a tension there that needs to be lanced somehow. Because we have a bunch of people who say that on the compliance land, they think whistleblowing is great, but we still do have mistreatment of whistleblowers and the defensive crouch. Anybody want to try and grab the hot potato there with how legal might make things more challenging?
I'll start because I'm sure there'll be 3 different opinions here. But at the end of the day, the compliance function and the legal function are different. And I know that in some organizations, those are combined, and in some organizations, they report to each other. But fundamentally, they're different, and they have different objectives. The compliance function is oriented on transparency, visibility, process, and problem resolution. The legal function is oriented on defending the organization. And in many instances, those interests align. But this is one of those categories where they specifically don't align. And you might get into this a little bit later, Matt, but as we think about the timing of things, the compliance view of how to handle something and the legal view of how to handle something will often be very different when it comes to these kinds of reports.
Mary, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think Evie makes a really great point, and it's not just legal. I think she also points out HR as well. I think there's a lot that can be done, and those tend to be the two areas where we do see more retaliation against whistleblowers. Compliance officers tend to be more well attuned. So I want to give a concrete example of sort of some of the issues that I've seen crop up with legal departments, which is that they're lawyers. They want to investigate things, and often remember the posture that a whistleblower may come to you is as a confidential or anonymous capacity. And there's a push because legal wants to know who that person is to try and get that person to, remove the veil. And I would really discourage that, especially in circumstances. I would say 99% of frauds, there are plenty of other people other than the whistleblower who could corroborate the wrongdoing. So I do think that you just have to be aware that legal has its own view. And I think Evie's response is correct, that training them about what happens, and I would use as a great teaching moment, again, the Boeing whistleblower committed suicide in the middle of depositions by Boeing counsel on his retaliation claim. That should not be lost on any of us. So I feel like there's a lot of sensitivity that needs to be, sensitivity training that needs to happen with lawyers in particular about what it means to be a whistleblower. And I think they also need to be thinking about themselves from the whistleblower's perspective.
Nick, any thoughts about corporate legal and how they can complicate the compliance officer whistleblower relationship?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of been touched on, I think. So I'll give you like a little analogy. I love the UFC. And so that's a mix of a bunch of different, fighting styles. And when a guy gets in trouble in a fight, he tends to revert back to like whatever his base style is. So if a guy came up as a wrestler or he came up as a kickboxer, that's like almost exclusively how he ends up fighting when he's in trouble. And I think to the extent that we have a disproportionate or like an oversampling of lawyers, or to the extent that compliance as a function is, influenced by, a lawyer background, I think that backup style is one of defensiveness. And I think it's just incumbent on us as we wear this other hat that's not, necessarily first and foremost about defensibility of the company, that we fight that tendency or fight that instinct to be in that sort of defensive stance. And to Jonathan's point, if we can put ourselves in the shoes of that whistleblower and we can engage into, the humanity of that interaction and really kind of empathize with that other human being, I think that can help kind of separate us from whatever that backup sort of defensive style might be.
I wanted to shift gears a little bit now to, you have the whistleblower complaint, you are talking to the whistleblower. Now the company's decided this violation they're alleging, this is a thing, this is for real. Should we disclose this to the government or not? And so going back to the Justice Department's whistleblower program, here is what DOJ says. I, internal whistleblower, report an issue to Nick, the compliance officer, and now the company knows. And then I say, you know what? I'm just going to go to the Justice Department and tell them anyway. So now DOJ knows as well. The DOJ policy is that if Nick's company then reports to the Justice Department, self-discloses within 120 days, you still get voluntary self-disclosure credit, even though I already told DOJ about what I know. So I interpreted that as really the department saying timely self-disclosure has to be within 120 days of you, company, knowing about it. First, I guess, Mary, you're the whistleblower lawyer. I'll ask you, am I right in interpreting things that way, or is there an alternative to look at it?
No, I think you're absolutely right. What DOJ is setting up is a race to the DOJ. right?
Okay.
They want to say who's going to get there first, and they want to give you a carrot to get there first. So I think it's really important to self-disclose, especially when you know that there's a whistleblower out there, because those whistleblowers are going to likely provide a lot of information already. So the cat's already out of the bag, and I think you're smart to come with hat in hand. Particularly if you have a whistleblower who's still employed at the company. And remember, sometimes we have multiple whistleblowers. I've had as many as 3 co-whistleblowers, 4 co-whistleblowers bring cases. So don't presume it's just one person with one vantage point on your organization. You may have multiples who have multiple vantage points who will be able to say what you are or are not doing. So I think you would be wise to heed the voluntary self-disclosure rules that are coming out of DOJ with this program. And that's why they're doing it, is to give you a carrot to come forward.
So then my next question would be, I have disclosed this item, and now the company says, how are we going to evaluate it? And the clock is now ticking at 120 days. So I guess, Jonathan, I'll turn it to you then. What should the company's process be to evaluate, do we want to self-disclose this or not? Or how quickly do we want to? And there's the clock, there's the calendar, and the days are falling off. What do you recommend for a good sort of process or discipline to think through these self-disclosure issues?
So there's a couple of things here. The first is it's a continuum of the item, right? There are some things when you hear the disclosure, you can validate it really quickly and you know clearly and convincingly this has occurred. That makes self-disclosure a question of how, not if. And companies should have a process to think about that. But in the majority of cases, what the whistleblower brings you is something that's going to take time to work through. And so the 120 days sounds kind of good as we all sit here on the phone theorizing about a number. But if anybody here has ever referred a criminal matter to the DOJ, they don't investigate it in 120 days. In fact, if you refer it to the FBI, they're not even talking to the DOJ within 120 days. So that time period is not sufficient for most white-collar investigations. And not to be a little bit snarky here, but we've had lots of OIG testimony on the Hill over the last few years investigating parts of the DOJ, and they don't respond within 120 days. So I think it's important for companies to get it right more than to get it fast. But that's the tension that should be carefully evaluated. And there are 3 stakeholders who should be in this: the compliance team that's working the issue, the legal team whose job is to defend the company, and the business executives who own this decision at the end of the day. Because if your compliance team is telling you this happened, now we're talking about how we do the voluntary disclosure. But if your compliance team is telling you, we don't know if this happened, then most organizations are going to want to know that answer before they start talking to the DOJ, because they're happy to disclose something that actually occurred, but knowledge and allegation are not the same thing. So where you are on that continuum matters.
Okay.
Can I interject just really quickly that in addition to the 120-day rule, I mean, I want to pick up on Jonathan's point that, timing, 120 days may be too slow. We should remember in False Claims Act cases, the Justice Department guidance talks about cooperation credit. And I see this regularly, that in a standard False Claims Act case that settles, if it doesn't settle and goes to trial, there's triple damages. But there can be double damages. Typically, you'll get double damages if you settle. And so one of the things the DOJ will do in a cooperation credit is actually lower the damages threshold for you. So I don't want us just to think that the only way a company can cooperate is using the 120-day timing on the DOJ program. There are other ways, and there are guidelines in place that people can look at that DOJ recognizes a good corporate actor who's complying with an investigation.
Nick, what do you think about all this? Like, there are a lot of competing interests here about what to do with the complaint. And, it's easy, I suppose, for compliance officers to say, we're on team disclose, because most of the time that's what we would always want to do, is step forward, admit our mistakes, and do the right thing. But I know it's going to be more complicated, and I know there would be other corporate interests pushing back to say, well, that might blow our quarterly numbers, or it might tie us up into knots for years. And how difficult can it be to kind of reach the right conclusion?
Well, I think Jonathan is right. You have to have a process in place. And, Mary is obviously not saying, set up an API between your case management system and DOJ so that everything is self-disclosed. Like, we have to have some, there's some subjectivity, there's some decision-making that goes in to whether or not, something even falls in a bucket of self-disclosable kind of items. And there's obviously going to be a ton of nuance and a ton of, business specific context that's going to maybe dictate that. To your point, maybe quarterly numbers and all those kinds of things, whether that's right or wrong, those are realities that are going to be in the mind of, at least that, corporate ultimate decision maker. But what I would say is by day 90, you should have a pretty good idea on whether you're going to self-disclose or not. So that kind of makes it, again, back to my point from before, really important to move on this stuff when you get it. If it's a high severity item, or if it's something that's going to be in that bucket for your particular business or your particular industry, that clock is ticking. And if you don't have checkpoints along the way to make sure that the investigation is moving, or you have a sort of sufficient level of certainty on whether the event even happened, then I think the odds of you getting sort of out over your skis is a lot higher.
I would just say the two extremes about what is timely and what's not that we've seen so far from DOJ. Several years ago, they had Cognizant Technologies settled a quite egregious FCPA case, and they had a very favorable settlement where DOJ really singled out their timely self-disclosure, which was a matter of a couple of weeks before they went to DOJ and said, we have this issue. And there was no way Cognizant knew within a couple of weeks where the final resolution would go. And the final resolution looked like it might be ugly because there were senior executives involved paying millions of dollars. But then at the other end was Albemarle, settled just last year, I think, where they had waited 18 months. And DOJ expressly said, that's not timely self-disclosure. And so somewhere in between there, I guess, is what's timely. And I don't know how subjective it might be. And I'm not sure how rigorously DOJ might enforce the 120-day sort of window. But those are some of the numbers I've seen floating around here. Mary, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about this issue before we wrap it up on what timely is and how many pages.
I just want folks to know that the DOJ, the SEC, don't only hold companies to a timeliness requirement. They also hold whistleblowers to a timeliness requirement. So the SEC in particular, the range of an award a whistleblower can get is 10 to 30%. But one of the things they can, so that's a large range. And one of the things they consider is if you sat on a potential report for a long time. That's a negative factor and probably will get you closer to the bottom of the range than the top. So I just want you to know that it's what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Timeliness matters, both to the whistleblower reporting and to the company.
I wanted to shift gears a little bit just to talk about the journey that whistleblowers undertake. And it's not easy. And Mary, you've mentioned several times the Boeing whistleblower, one of many, and he committed suicide. And there have been many other whistleblowers I've talked to where, their career goes straight into the ditch and their years of struggle. And then maybe at the end, they might win something like $600,000 or $700,000, maybe more, maybe less. But even then, if you're a mid-career professional and you have a mortgage, you have kids who are going to go to college and your career is tanked and here's $600,000 for the rest of your life, that's not a lot of money. But I don't know, Mary, first I'll ask you, and then Jonathan and Nick, if you have any other thoughts as well, just what is the journey for these whistleblowers like once they decide to do this?
Yeah, I think you've touched on, what is very intuitive to a lot of people, which is the negative career ramifications. Obviously, for whistleblowers, they may never work in that career again. They're often blacklisted. Future employers are not going to want to hire them. So I think that's all very intuitive. I think what we're getting more evolved in our thinking, and we're getting a lot more data, is on the personal. psychological harm to whistleblowers. And I think the Me Too movement gave us a lot of more context for what that might look like in terms of gaslighting and just the psychosocial dimension. So I would say I'd recommend people, the New England Journal of Medicine did a study on pharmaceutical whistleblowers in the pharmaceutical industry, and basically said whistleblowers have a higher incidence of divorce, of alcohol abuse, of depression, and that comes because of the fact that whistleblowers often lose their support network. So what happens when a whistleblower is retaliated against is they basically become radioactive in the workplace. And so they will not be invited to meetings, and they will really lose all of their friends, because the signal that's sent is that, if you become a whistleblower, this is going to happen to me. So it's like you're contagious. So you lose your support network, which for a lot of us, as we know, because Americans are so focused on our jobs and that's so much of our life, you lose a lot of your self-worth. And then you start to doubt yourself, right? Because you're like, why am I the only person? If the company has circled the wagons and has retaliated against you, you start to say like, well, maybe I'm crazy. Everyone else seems to think that this is okay. So you get into a place where you're doubting yourself, you don't have friends any longer. And this is where I think some very dire consequences can happen. And I think what we in the whistleblower support community have done is really tried to create a safety net around whistleblowers in terms of encouraging therapy. And I tell my clients from the very beginning, I often encourage them from day one, you may have a great legal claim, but should you bring it? Do you have the intestinal fortitude to? And I often make sure that it is a family decision. Because remember, whistleblowers are often making this decision to the extent that they are actually affirmatively making a decision to whistleblower. Sometimes they've been doing it as part of their job, and they're head of internal audit and they've made a report that they're required to do, and then they're treated like a whistleblower. But to the extent that you actually get to affirmatively choose to be a whistleblower, it is something that you need to go in with your eyes wide open. And whistleblowers are often in extremis when they're making that decision. You can imagine the pressures that they're under, and that is not the best time to be making a life-changing decision. So we try and slow things down and involve the family and talk about the repercussions and talk about what the journey will look like, so that they go in with their eyes wide open if they're going to do it.
Now, well, thank God for you, Mary, because there is no support for these folks. And I mean, it's so sick to me. We interviewed Sharon from Enron. She was the whistleblower for Enron. And, Enron was on, I don't know, Fortune or something for most ethical company of the year or something. They were touted for, them being such a values-driven organization. And I think a whistleblower is going to take that at face value. And if they see something wrong, it's, it grates against them. It grates against their their sense of justice that's wired into them. And they speak up about it, and then they're a pariah. I mean, the payouts that folks get for whistleblowing rarely compensates for the radioactivity that comes after the fact. And I don't know. I just think it's really tragic that organizations tout these values, and they say, hey, speak up, and then somebody actually engages in that, and then they can't find a job for decades after that. I think it's crazy.
So Jonathan, give me your response to that, including the idea that compliance should play a role in protecting whistleblowers. And we've got a couple of different comments from the audience here stressing that to the extent that compliance function can, you should be running interference and protecting their identity. And we all know the anti-retaliation expectations and whatnot. But this still seems like this is a very arduous thing, and unfortunately a very common thing for whistleblowers. So what can compliance officers do about this scenario, this fact of life?
Yeah, no, it's really important. And it goes into two sort of things in my head. The first one is, we welcome information coming from all sources. And my team and I work on all sorts of reports that come in, from minor to major, without regard to who the reporter is, right? So sometimes Mary mentioned this earlier, this tendency to really want to know who the person is. And we don't care. We care about the information. So that's the thing that drives value. And there is over multiple organizations, I've had this conversation several times in my career, where I had to remind people that we don't actually care who reports the news, we care about the news. and get people to break free of that, because it can free them from the temptation to walk down the retaliation path. People who report significant wrongdoing are taking a lot on their shoulders. But the vast majority of people who blow the whistle on something are on really small issues and minor issues. And we shouldn't lose sight of that, because we want the right process. The second direction is this informs the organizational culture. Your values are not a sign that you hang on the wall. Your values are how you live and breathe as an actual organization. There was a story yesterday or today talking about a New York police officer who had been giving tickets to people who were carrying friends and family cards, and was getting a lot of retaliation from the NYPD, because those were sort of get out of jail free cards for minor crimes in New York. And it's a known way of doing business, and it's the culture of the organization. And so if you work in a culture that allows people to speak up, you're going to find that these issues play out very differently. And if you work in a culture that is very closed ranked and very protective, you're going to see a very different response to these. So to your core question, the compliance team should be trying to get to the root of issues, not trying to get to the who said of the issues. That's the core differentiator.
And now, so we've got about 15 minutes left, and I wanted to focus on one other sort of trending in the news item about whistleblowing, which is retaliation clauses in employment contracts, where the company basically compels a employee to be quiet and do not go to regulators unless specifically you get our permission to do so first. If you go to them, you might forfeit your severance agreements, something like that. Retaliation enforcement is not new from the SEC. They've been doing this for, I think, nearly a decade, but it's been on my mind because they just sanctioned 7 firms, I think it was on Monday, a total of $3 million for retaliation agreements that were still in place clear into 2023, when this had become an enforcement issue in 2016. And this time around, it was all of the companies said, you may, of course, go to a whistleblower anytime you feel that you should, but you have to sign away your rights to any financial reward that might come from a regulator's award program. And I was just struck thinking, folks, this is why we can't have nice things, because it is so clear what the SEC wants to see, and yet we're playing too cute by half, and now there's more enforcement. So I am still wondering, why is this so hard to get right? Jonathan, I'll start with you, and then Mary, if you have any thoughts, and then Nick. But I mean, come on, for real? 7 years later, we're still struggling with this?
So one of the things that's important for an accountability perspective is this is going to be a decision that was driven by the business, certainly not one by the compliance department, and likely not one by the legal department, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to be somebody saying, I want to make sure that people don't do A, B, C. And instead of either the legal person or the compliance person having their own intestinal fortitude to say, that's not how we're going to operate things. You can always go talk to anybody you want to. We're not going to ask people to be silent. We're not going to ask people to sign away any of their rights. We're going to ask people to say whatever needs to be said. Our internal process, and I've built this at numerous organizations, is we'd love you to go to your manager. We want you to talk to HR or legal or compliance or any other supporting function. We want you to talk to a senior leader, and we have a hotline. And if you're not happy with that, you can go talk to an external regulator. We'd lay out all the options on day one as to all the paths that you could take forward, because trying to tell people not to do something, I'll defer to Mary on her experience here. I've done it for about as long as she has, I think, but that's the fact they're going to use against you in this case, is that you were trying to shut this down. And again, from a compliance perspective, our goal is the free and transparent flow of information. When I see a company like that, to put it bluntly, I know a place I don't want to work.
And so, Mary, I don't know what thoughts you might have here, but to me, it just seems like this is Control F. You find all the retaliation language, you hit delete, and that should be the end of it. But how is this still a thing that corporations are engaging in?
Well, I think it's a lot of what we see just generally, and this is, I guess, my jaded view that a lot of companies see paying fines to the government as the cost of doing business, right? So these kinds of clauses are incredibly insidious. We've seen that when we started with the Me Too movement and non-disparagement clauses. So there are a lot of people who read these clauses, don't know that they're unenforceable, take them at face value, and say often, right, they come up in a separation agreement. So you were just handed a large paycheck to get yourself out the door, and you jeopardize all that, or at least you think you do, because you're quote unquote violating the terms. So it's a very effective tool if you have bad intent in terms of wanting to silence people from going to regulators. So I would love to see the fines be larger. But yes, these are incredibly important rules, and it is, to me, notable that the SEC has been kind of unique among the various regulators in imposing these fines and doing it en masse. And to me, it's showing that they don't want to bite the hand that feeds. And so I guess my other comment I would want to make is, please, when you're thinking about this, and that's what these 7 new fines showed up this week shows you, remember, don't just look at your employment agreements and your separation agreements. You really should be looking more broadly, your codes of conduct, your trade secret agreements. Like, it can show up in a number of different places. So I would encourage people to be very expansive. But yeah, I think retaliation can be really effective. And I think that's why a lot of people put it in there. And I think that's why it's still in there. They're going to run the risk, the roulette wheel that maybe the SEC is not going to find out.
But I mean, how does, please go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to ask one more legal question. Do we know whether the Justice Department might try retaliation enforcement now as well, now that it has its own awards program?
It doesn't have the same authority, right? So the rule in the SEC is part of the Dodd-Frank enacting regulation. So it's Rule 21F17. So, they're hamstrung because they're doing this based on a different problem. So I think, unless you're interfering with a witness, I think they have limited powers. I mean, they're rattling their swords and their sabers saying we care about this, but I don't feel like they have the same statutory authority that SEC does.
All right. Nick, I'm sorry. What were you going to say?
No, you're good. I guess I don't really understand, like, what teeth does that language in the employment agreement actually have? Is there legal, grounds, I guess, for them to say, you can report, but you waive your rights to the payout or to the reward? And if not, is it just merely a signal to try to stop people from doing that external reporting by, implicitly, whether true or not, removing that incentive?
Mary,
I think one of the issues is that Matt gave you, Nick, just one example of some of the offending language, right? Which is that you can report to the regulator, but you won't get a reward. So a lot of people looking at that were like, well, I guess I shouldn't go to the SEC because I can't avail myself of that program. But some of the worst language that gets in there is basically saying you need to report to the company first before you go to a regulator. And so those sorts of things make a whistleblower think, well, maybe I shouldn't, then you're losing your ability to go. So I think there's just a number of ways that it chills speech. So they want to address all of that. And then there's some nefarious language that's included in these agreements.
Thank you for that. And sorry for that really confusing question, but you answered it. So that was great.
I mean, I guess, my question here is fundamentally, this is still about keeping whistleblowers on the company's side, for lack of a better way to say it, and all the measures that you should be trying to take, whether that is anti-retaliation specifically or just good, strong messages from the CEO that they want whistleblowers to speak up and they will view retaliation very harshly. What are the measures that make the most difference here? And Jonathan, since you're the one who's in-house running a compliance and ethics program, what do you see as the most important steps a company should take to keep whistleblowers feeling comfortable, feeling like the company is with me, so I don't need to run off to a lawyer, run off to a regulator, and make things enormously more complicated for everyone? what should the company and the compliance program be doing to keep whistleblowers in the comfort zone?
So I'm going to lean into my own bias here, which is I think that a major part of what a compliance program should do is listen and be responsive. So companies need to have enough resources in their ethics and compliance program that people can respond timely to issues that come up and can reach out and listen to what people have to say. Again, in a really well-designed speak-up culture, people are going to raise things all the time, and most of them will be small issues that you're going to be able to resolve fairly easily. Occasionally, there's going to be some meteor shower type event, and we're going to need to deal with that. But you create trust by building a timeline that says people come to this group all the time and their issues get resolved. And that's what we want to make sure that we're doing effectively throughout the organization. It's this concept of listening to our employees instead of trying to stifle them that becomes key. And that's why I say at the end of the day, this comes back to culture. You have a leadership team that wants to know the truth, or you have a leadership team that wants to hear what they want to hear. And if you're in one of those organizations, there's almost no way to build an effective whistleblower program. And if you're in an organization that hears things, it's really easy to do it in lots of different ways, whether you do it the way I would do it or the way somebody else would. But are you listening? Are you communicating? Are you educating about where you are in the process? And then are you successfully resolving issues? Sometimes that successful resolution is disclosing to the government. Sometimes it's fixing processes. Sometimes it's firing managers. There's lots of different potential solutions. But when a reporter sees you take action, they feel like they're on the company's side. That's the alignment piece. When they feel like you don't care, they're going to keep telling that story until they find somebody who will listen.
So, Mary, give me your take on this as well, because I suspect you've seen a lot of companies where once you hear the complaint, you're like, well, what else did they think this whistleblower was going to do if that's just the way the company behaves? But I mean, give me your thoughts as well on how to make sure it doesn't get to these unpleasant points. And then, Nick, I'll circle back to you for the last words.
Yeah, so I have a couple of big thoughts here. If I could arm every compliance officer with one study for them to give to their C-suite, it is one that the Harvard Business Review reported on, and I can put the link in the chat, to professors from GWU and University of Utah, that really debunks the myth that whistleblowers are disloyal and actually turns it and shows that whistleblowers not only are they loyal, but when they are allowed to perform their risk management function, they make companies more profitable. So
Right.
The data that they took basically shows that companies who have hotlines that are ringing off the hook are more profitable than companies whose hotlines are silent. And that allows the canary in the coal mine function. But how that profit is manifested is because they have fewer investigations, fewer lawsuits, and the lawsuits they do have settle for far less. So I always like to use that as a starting point to really speak to the C-suite where they are, which is that whistleblowing is profitable. It's good for the business. It saves you money. So I think that's one of my biggest takeaways in terms of what can we do to encourage whistleblowing and get management on your side. Of course, you're going to have the Theranoses of the world. My client, Tyler Schultz, like there's no amount of training that would have had Elizabeth Holmes doing the right thing, right? And so
if she would have just seen that study, if she would have just seen that study.
So, there is a limit to what can be done here. But I think starting by debunking the myth and celebrating whistleblowers for what they are and seeing them as, I always say, as a CEO's best friend, not as a disloyal snitch.
Well, and that's our biggest job. Our job is a job of persuasion. And what you're talking about is reframing this thing that an executive might look at as, a threat, and seeing it that it's a real opportunity.
I just wanted to say quickly, I also think if you reframe it in the converse, I have worked with people who could not be bothered to call the hotline if the building were on fire. They would just, whatever, I guess I'll leave. And who on earth would think that is a good, healthy culture? And yet,
Exactly.
If you encourage it, people are going to take over that sort of, that attitude will take over. But Nick, we're just about out of time.
Can I add just one quick thing? Because I know we talked about There was one last thing about the gendered, I saw a question about the gendered nature of whistleblowing. And there are studies, and I think it's really important that companies know that studies show that women and people of color are much more likely to leave an organization rather than to report. And in fact, women tend to suffer the effects of retaliation more severely than do men. I think it's important that people know that. And I think one of the things you can do is really be robust in your exit interviews and in finding ways, including embracing technologies that a la the Me Too movement allow whistleblowers to speak up together. If there's a way that we can collectivize whistleblowing, think about VW, emissions cheating scandal, or Boeing. There are multiple whistleblowers sounding off. If they weren't in silos and there's a way that they could be reporting together, we would get more reports.
Well, there's strength in numbers, right? There's that sort of pack mentality that we can kind of fold into, and that's going to, it's a whole distribution of people, right? Like there's some people that are going to speak up regardless of the implications. They are built with that intestinal fortitude, and there are others in that sort of middle that we need to convince. The one thing I would say that the one thing organizations can do, the best thing an organization can do to promote this sort of speak up culture is elevate whistleblowers. There are people that have reported to your hotline in the last year that would be willing to get on a quick video and talk about that experience. If there's someone who has been a whistleblower who's been elevated instead of, ostracized and thrown out of the organization, elevate those people to positions of power. Those are the things that are going to help other folks who are maybe lower down on the food chain, get that confidence to, engage in, speaking up.
All right. Well, we are pretty much out of time. So Jonathan Turner, Mary Inman, thank you both very much. It's been a lovely, excellent, informative session. Nick, I don't know if you have any other closing words, but it's been another great session as usual.
Yeah, thank you guys all for coming. Hope you enjoyed it. We're pretty close. So I may have to drag this out because we're pretty close to 5,000. And that was my big goal for today. But, John, hey, John, he said in the chat, sometimes compliance feels like a whistleblower inside the own organization. And that just speaks to this thing that a lot of us feel where, we're carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders and we're kind of alone. If this session or, Ethicsverse in general can prove anything to you, is that there are thousands of people throughout the world who think like you do and believe the same things you do. So, get some power from that, get some energy from this amazing community that we're all a part of. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Oh, 5,800. My goodness.